Good evening, everyone. My name is Kelly Long, and I'm a senior curatorial assistant here at the Whitney Museum. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are gathered on unceded homelands of the Lenape people. As a result of centuries of colonialism, today the Lenape live in a diaspora throughout the US and Canada. Alongside the Lenape, many other indigenous nations have ancestral ties to this place now known as New York, including the 6 Haudenosaunee nations: Seneca, Cayuga, Tuscarora, Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga, and the Shinnecock and Puspatuck. I also want to acknowledge that the land at the center of the conversation tonight, Daufuskie Island, Hilton Head Island, and the neighboring South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands, is the unceded homeland of the Muskogee, Yamasee, and Uwale people. If you are joining us online, please take a moment to identify and recognize the indigenous people who have always and continue to store the land from which you're joining us. This evening's conversation brings together 3 devoted cultural caretakers on the occasion of the exhibition Jeanne Moutoussamy-Ashe and the Last Gullah Islands, on view now in the 7th floor permanent collection galleries. It's a show that pictures Daufuskie Island's Gullah Geechee community between 1977 and 1982, a period of enormous change for the island and its people, as commercial real estate development, pollution from the Savannah River, and destruction from Hurricane David alongside other forces made the Gullah Geechee way of life increasingly hard to hold on to. When Jeanne arrived on the island for the first time, guided by Emory Shaw Campbell, there were just around 80 permanent residents left, and the photographs that Jeanne made with them, portraits, images of labor and leisure, celebrations, and farewells, would prove ever more precious as that number grew smaller, and the one version of Daufuskie Island became accessible only through memory and through pictures. I want to thank the Whitney's Director of Public Programs and Academic Engagement, Megan Hoyer, for her work on this program, as well as Public Programs intern Queenie Sue, and former Coordinator of Public Programs and Public Engagement, Andy Hawks. I'd also like to thank our colleagues on the museum's retail team for making books by each of our 3 speakers available for purchase just outside of the theater. So please take a look at these if you haven't already on your way in. Finally, I want to thank the Whitney's Nancy and Steve Crown Family Chief Curator, Kim Conatee, for her support of this evening, and Donna Rosen, whose gift of works by Jeanne to the permanent collection has made our exhibition possible. And of course, I want to thank our 3 speakers, who I'll now briefly introduce before turning the evening over to them. Jeanne Moutoussamy-Ashe is an artist and activist whose intimately personal work has modeled trust building and devotion for a generation of younger art makers, and on a personal note for this young curator. Often her work engages with the lasting legacies of slavery here in the US and globally, but it also imagines more just and joyful futures for her primarily Black subjects. Her work has appeared in Life, Ebony, Essence, People, and the New York Times, and has been shown in solo and group exhibitions around the world, including at the Museum of Modern Art and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She is the author of 5 books, including Daufuskie Island, a photographic essay, and 1986's Viewfinders, Black Women Photographers. She currently serves as the director of the Arthur Ashe Endowment for the Defeat of AIDS and has a forthcoming book of photographs from her time in South Africa, which will be published through the Gordon Parks Foundation later this year. Dr. Emory Campbell Shaw is a scholar, educator, and cultural conservationist who was born on Hilton Head Island and continues to make his home there to this day. From 1980 to 2002, he served as executive director of the Penn Center on St. Helena Island, advancing the center's mission to promote and educate around Gullah Geechee history, arts, foodways, music, and other traditions through initiatives like the annual Heritage Days celebration. His unwavering commitment to the Gullah Geechee people in and around the Sea Islands has made him a trusted and beloved figure in the area and a preeminent resource for all those wanting to learn about its history and culture. The current president of and educator with Gullah Heritage Consulting Services, he is also the author of Gullah Cultural Legacies and Gullah Days, Hilton Head Islanders Before the Bridge, 1861 to 1956. Deborah Willis, Dr. Deborah Willis, who will moderate the conversation this evening, is a celebrated artist, curator, and historian of photography, whose art and research has focused on cultural histories envisioning the Black body, women, and gender. a MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellow and current university professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. She also serves as the director of NYU's Center for Black Visual Culture and the Institute for African American Affairs. Her many books include Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers, 1840 to the Present, The Black Female Body, A Photographic History, co-authored with Carla Williams, and the recently released Kamala, Her Historic, Joyful, and Auspicious Sprint to the White House. Please join me in welcoming Jeanne, Emory, and Deb, to who I now turn things over.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and Kelly, and the invitation from the Whitney. It's really important to just reimagine this history that we all lived in the 60s and 70s as we rethink the experience of Gullah culture, but also the experiences that Emory Campbell brings with us today with Jeanne Moutoussamy-Ashe. But I'm really here excited to just think about how Daufuskie, Penn Center, and St. Helena's Island in South Carolina, what it meant to me in the 70s and what it meant to many of us who were exploring the South during this time period. We know Emory Campbell. He's recognized as a scientist, environmentalist, his face and grace, graceful face and image over the Penn Center. I recall meeting Emory back in the early 80s, and Jeanne, of course, met him in the 70s. But I'd like to start off with Jeanne, who's recognized as a photographer, as Kelly mentioned, in a wide range of topics, but from social justice in South Africa to families here in the States. But I'd like to start off with just asking, how did you two meet?
Well, we met through a very good friend, Verda Mae Grosvenor, who I met her even though she was from Beaufort, South Carolina, and had been a longtime friend of Emory's. And when I met her, I knew who she was, but I just went up to her at an event and introduced myself and told her that I was interested in the Sea Islands, that I had been to Edisto Island. And a friend of ours, another friend of ours, Donald Bogle, who was you know Donald very well, was a good friend of Verda's. And that kind of got me in the door with Donald Bogle. And she said, well, where have you been on the islands? And I said, Edisto Island, a couple of the other, Septima Clark's Island. John's Island, yes. Okay, so I made it to a few islands in the very beginning on my first trip. And Verda said, have you been to Daufuskie Island? And I said, what is Daufuskie Island? I really had not heard of it. And she said, if you haven't been to Daufuskie Island, you haven't been to the islands. And so she piqued my interest immediately with that comment. I said, how do I get to Daufuskie? She said, well, I have a good friend, enter Emory. She said, he lives on Hilton Head Island, and you should meet Emory. And she introduced us, and in 1977, or maybe towards the end of 1977 or 1978, I had coordinated with Emory and with Verda Mae to go to Hilton Head Island, and that Emory Campbell would take us over to Daufuskie Island and introduce me to the island. So that's how I met Emory, by meeting Verda. And by meeting Emory, that was the beginning of the relationship with Daufuskie Island, and that was 77 or 78.
So Emory, tell me about your experience the first time you met, or tell us, all of us, how you met Jeanne, when you first met Jeanne, and the connection with Verda Mae. Verda Mae is a writer, an anthropologist in terms of foodways and storyteller. Mm-hmm. And we have a photograph later, but I just wanted to find out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do. Be glad to see Una. that's Gullah for how you doing. Glad to see you. But that's how I greeted Jeannie. She didn't. I really was elated to hear that Jeanne Ashe was coming to the area. We had been trying to meet her husband, Arthur, because Arthur had been coming to the area to play tennis, and at that time we had a little renaissance of black culture. Y'all remember that in the 70s? You're too young. But in the 70s, we were really anxious to be black. And anybody who was black on a national stage like Arthur, we wanted to be a part of him. But he would come to Hilton Head and play tennis, and we never could get in touch with Arthur. And then Bertha May said, Arthur Ashe's wife wants to go to Daufuskie. so yeah, I'll swim her over to Daufuskie. And so we had been working on Daufuskie for several years because Daufuskie needed everything, water, sewage. I was an environmentalist. They needed better housing. They needed a better boat to get on and off of the island. And so we were actively working on Daufuskie almost weekly. And we had a little old boat. And so Jeannie came, and we were very happy to take Jeannie to Daufuskie. And when Jeannie and Arthur went with us to Daufuskie, Jeannie being a photographer, we didn't know what the folks what to expect from the folks, but when we got over that rough water, have anybody read Pat Conroy's book, The Water is Wide? He was a teacher on Daufuskie. So we went over to Daufuskie, Debbie, and when we got to the landing, after we had met Jeannie and we had gotten to be friendly, we knew Jeannie was very much wanted to take a photograph. But at the dock that day was a man sitting on an ox cart, and we hadn't told him that we would bring a photographer over. But he was sitting on this ox cart as if he was posing for a photograph.
That's fantastic. Can you tell us about the Penn Center, a little history about the Penn Center?
Penn Center, I got to be the director a few years later, but Penn Center is located on St. Helena Island. How many people have been there other than? St. Helena Island is just outside of Beaufort, and it's a center now of some 50 acres, but it was a school for freed slaves. Got started in 1862. It was a transformative school in that it was really established to really transform former enslaved people into proper Americans. And so the graduates of Penn School don't really have much to do with Gullah. And so I go over there as a director, and everybody who came after, scholars like you, Debbie, wanted to know about Gullah culture. and I tell them, get away from here, because Penn School is not about preserving Gullah. But anyhow, it has turned out to become the center of Gullah culture because we have convinced the graduates of Penn School that that's the culture from which they came, and that's the culture everybody is interested in knowing about.
But
So,
you were born on Hilton Head.
yes.
And you studied at Savannah State, or?
Yes, I studied biology at Savannah State, and
Did you know
just-
you wanted to spend your life back in Hilton Head
no.
when studying? Because when we think about the land and the waterways and the foodways that we know today, and we have a romantic notion of Gullah culture based on, you know, the many stories, but also the experience of Reconstruction, you know, slavery and that experience. So can you talk to us a little bit about the corridor?
Yes, this this corridor came about because our culture is based on, it's really based in the land. That's where the families are. That's where we get our seafood, right on the coast. And that's where we're pretty much isolated from the mainland, or we have been for many years. And so this corridor is where Gullah people live. This is where Gullah people practice the culture.
And the
And-
language as well.
And the language. And it evolved because nobody else was around. Too hot, too many mosquitoes. You couldn't get there to these islands along the coast. And but the majority of the land was always owned by outside landowners. And so now it's being inundated by developers, and that's why we wanted to preserve the culture, and we asked the federal government to designate it as a Gullah corridor.
And Jeanne, you were involved as well because your husband spent a lot of time at Hilton Head Island,
Right.
and you began photographing there as well.
I did, but the reason that I wanted to go to the South Carolina Sea Islands was from spending my junior year in an independent study during college on the west coast of Africa. And I was there for 6 months, and an experience of going to the Cape Coast Castle in Accra, Ghana, is what really, it was such an impactful experience to stand at the porthole of the castle and actually look out and experience and see where the transatlantic slave trade actually took place.
And we see that basically connection here. with
Yes,
this
exactly,
graphic.
in this slide. That had a tremendous impact on me, and there were fishing villages all along the coast there. And I started thinking about, you know, that you look out the porthole and you can't help but think about that, you know, that journey, that horrific experience, and yet what happened. Because when I was in high school, in the Catholic schools, we didn't learn really about slavery. You know, we knew what happened, but we weren't learning about it in our history books, truly. And so this was something that I was very interested in knowing what happened. What were these places like that were the first places where people were ending up this journey? And I thought about it when I came back to the U.S. in June of '74, and decided I had to go to the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands. And there's a slide that you're presenting, and I know it's coming up soon, of a book that was published, Face of an Island, by Lee Minor. And that was one of the first books I had seen about the Sea Island culture. And that piqued my interest even more. So I graduated in '75, and in 2 years, I was on the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands. And within a year after that, I met Emory. And that's
But you
really how
wanted
that
to
happened.
also make a difference in terms of education and holding on to the land based on documenting this experience.
Well, that is true. I mean, Emory brought up land as well, and the one thing that you recognize is that the people who lived on Sea Islands and Gullahs were land rich. And at that time, you were hearing about development coming to Daufuskie Island, because if anybody's been to Hilton Head Island, you know what development is like in the Sea Islands. So one of the things that Emory said to me the first time, I'm kind of jumping around here, but if one of the things he said to me, I think on that first trip, when we first got there. He described me, you heard him speaking some Gullah here, but he described me as a Furbinya, a Furkamya. And I said, a what? He said, no, I'm a Furbinya, you're a Furkamya. And that was fascinating to me, you know, like I'm new to this place, and so I'm coming for the first time, and this was his homeland. And I learned what that meant by the property that everyone owned and how important that was to them. That they were land rich. And the other important thing about Daufuskie that's so unique and that Verda had pointed out to me is there's no bridge linking it to the mainland. And that made it extremely unique and also, you know, allowed the culture to prevail.
And that's what's so fascinating looking at your photographs and thinking, as I remember, looking closely as wanted to revisit with the exhibition, is that you feel the atmosphere. You know, like you have this photograph of a car without the window, and you know what it means to feel humidity, and then to have the close up. Go ahead.
I was just going to comment about that picture about Susie Smith, who is the lady that I stayed with whenever I would go to Daufuskie over the 5-year period that I visited on and off the island photographing. But you're right about the heat and the environment, and no cars are really allowed on Daufuskie Island. So this is why this car has no windows. I mean, it's just a way of transportation to get around the island, but it broke down several times when we were riding in the car. But I was sitting in the front seat, and I turned around to look at Susie, and the light on her face is what I thought was so extraordinary, with the look that she had on her face at that moment. And a lot of that light was reflecting off of the white plastic that was posing as a window. And that was I think that struck me more than anything on that photograph.
How did you meet some of the people there? This is iconic for me. Her smile.
That's Blossom.
Her look.
Lavinia Blossom Robinson. Everybody, her nickname was Blossom, but she was quite a character. She was the matriarch of the island.
She
and
feels as if she owns
yeah,
this, right?
exactly. And that's exactly how she carried herself, you know. And it wasn't a struggle to photograph Blossom, but it took a while to warm up to Blossom and for her to allow me to photograph her. But this
So trust
photograph
is really important.
it was very
Right.
important. I mean, it took the first year. I really had to pick my times when to photograph and when not to photograph to gain that trust. But I was actually walking on the road, just walking around the island one day, and I came up to Blossom's house, and she had a huge screen porch on the front of her house. It was huge, and I just decided, let me go see Blossom. And I knocked on her door, and she was sitting kind of bent over like this in a chair in the front, and I knocked on the door, and then I saw her sitting there. And I said, Blossom, can I come in? She hadn't said anything to this point. And she said, come on in, because she knew what I was up to. And so we spent a little time sitting on the porch talking, and then I asked her if I could take her photograph. She said, you took enough pictures of me.
Emory,
But
did you
okay.
know her?
Oh, yeah,
Uh-huh.
very
And
much.
Everybody knew Blossom.
Yes, no nonsense lady.
She truly was, but she was, that's where that photograph was taken.
And so this is the boat that you were on?
This is the boat that I traveled to Daufuskie from, usually when I would come from Harbor Town, which is on Hilton Head Island, and is the closest point
Yes,
from Hilton Head Island to Daufuskie to go across Calabogue Sound.
right.
And how long?
On Jake's boat, probably
15, 20 minutes.
It's
15.
a lot faster than the big boats, yeah, because it was a speedboat. But and you can believe me, I was holding on
Right.
really tight going across the Sound.
But also, you know, you chose to print and photograph in black and white, but I still see green here. I still see this such luscious green
Yeah.
that I imagine, you know, the trees and the land, and just curious about why you chose black and white.
Black and white has always been my favorite, most creative way of seeing. I see in black and white, and I don't negate color, but I had a teacher once who gave an assignment. I think it was Joel Meyerowitz or Gary Winogrand, but one of them gave an assignment of, I want you to go out and photograph with color film. It was Joel. And don't think about having color in your camera. Because I was studying mostly black and white, and that kind of turned me around. And I started seeing colors as gradations and not thinking about or being seduced by a color, but instead thinking about tones and the quality and shapes more so than being attracted to colors. So for me, this whole project was a black and white project. And
But
I
think
also,
about labor as well. I'm sorry to cut
No,
you
no,
off, but
go
I was
ahead.
thinking about Emory when you see this photograph, this clothesline, and these are some tall people. These pants are pretty long. So I'm just curious. Just curious. Is everyone in that area 6 feet and over?
Not really. I don't know how you got to reach. I don't know how to reach that line there.
Right. But I just find it fascinating that the way the clothesline, and I know there's a woman who's washing these clothes, and what is she standing on to hang these
right.
clothes? You know, so it's just
It looked like that was a prop
it does,
where
doesn't
you
it?
could
It's like
so you could move that. You could move that prop, and the line would fall closer
Right.
to the ground.
Doesn't look like that.
so. Who lived in this house?
That I don't know. I mean, I was just walking on the road, and I did not stop in this house. So I'm not absolutely sure. Sorry, the microphone. I'm not absolutely sure who owned that house.
But also, when Kelly mentioned the number of people who lived there during that time, and it looked like half of the people are here at this wedding.
Well, yes. I mean, this was Janice and Joe Gordon's wedding, and Janice was born on Daufuskie. That's her brother, the young man that's to her right, and her mother to the right of her brother, and then her sister. So, I mean, she was a native Daufuskian, and this probably, and I think, was the last wedding of that size that was held at the Union Baptist Church, which was at the time a 150-year-old church. So it's a 200-year-old church now, Emory?
Still there.
Because that was almost 50 years ago.
Still there.
Is it
And it's still there.
Was it the only church Baptist in?
There was another church as well, but this one was the most prominent.
Can you talk about foodways and labor and what the experience was you documented, and Emory in terms of the land when you talked about the water during that time period, that when you were there, when you were invited back to kind of think about how, you know, a lot of people were losing their land and also
Oh, yes,
the insects.
Yeah, this was, it's really how we lived. That's how we gathered food from the land and from the waterways. And this is typical of a crab catch of nice blue crabs. And Daufuskie is known for its delicacy of crab, what we call devil crabs, a delicacy. And you got a Daufuskie devil crab and you've had something. But they caught crabs in abundance, and then you could boil them in the backyard, and you could pull the meat from him, and you could prepare them.
So what about the trade in terms of going to Charleston or other areas? Was there a fisher community, a fisherman's community there?
At one time, there was what we call a crab man would come by in a boat, and you would sell the crabs to him. He'd have a scale on the boat, and he would pay you right there, and that happened daily. In the old days, you cut crabs by baiting a line and laying it along the water, right around the shoreline. And then you would take your dip net, and you'd have, every foot you'd have a piece of meat for the crab to grab. And then you would row your boat, and as the line come out of the water, the crab is attached to the meat, and you take your dip net and take the crab from the meat, and you put it in a barrel in the boat, and did that for all day. Early in the morning, you got up and you get back home late in the afternoon. About 50 pounds of crabs and 2-3 cents a pound.
And
That's
what
how
about
the Daufuskie-
education there? What was the experience with education on the island from before, like the Penn Center was a school? What is this area here?
Well, this was in Mary Fields Elementary School was in Daufuskie, but this is actually on Edisto Island, which was one of the first islands that I visited, and it's a high school graduation, obviously. But Daufuskie did have, Emory mentioned Pat Conroy, who taught at the one-room schoolhouse, and then Mrs. Frances Jones, who's you'll see often in pictures in the book, was the school teacher on Daufuskie. And then there were the Albertos. Yeah, that taught on the island for a while.
What's fascinating about this image is the sense of order and the sense of pride that you were able to capture within this. And then also the aspect of the American flag. We're here, and that aspect of how do we feel about patriotism and the education aspect of this.
Absolutely. No, this was, that was an important photograph for me to actually witness, to take it, because I had not seen this on the islands previous to this, and the formality of the graduation, and yet it's in a football field. That to me was, that was I thought a true island experience on Edisto. So yeah, that's how I remember that experience of being very fortunate to have gone to this graduation. I did know a woman who I had met on Edisto Island. Margaret was her name. Her brother was graduating, and so I attended the graduation with her. Very lucky to experience that.
And is this the same church that?
Yes. Yes.
I think this is another image that I find just significant in terms of the profile. His tilt of his hat. We feel Sunday, but we feel sun, and the way that you capture this. I just feel the warmth of this image in a beautiful way as we think about joy. So you've captured labor, you've captured families, the aspect of joy, and then this quiet image of a screen. And we know the mosquitoes are known for wreaking havoc on families and food and joy, but there's a peaceful painting in this moment. It feels like that. Can you talk about this image?
Well, I think that image is a sort of a classic Southern representation of the screen door in the South. I mean, I grew up in Chicago and used to visit my family members in New Orleans when I was a kid. We'd take the train down from Chicago to New Orleans, and I remember these screen doors, and I saw this girl, Marcia, standing in the in the screen door and took her picture. I met her parents and spent an afternoon there, and became friends with one of her cousins. So yeah, it's the picture speaks to the experience, I think.
But also family stories. It looks
Yes.
as if she wants to be out there. So I'm just curious about. That's why when I think about your photographs, you capture this feeling of weather, and I don't know if it's the protection of the screen, or there's a desire to move through that screen.
It's an interesting assessment of looking through or looking out of a screen. But she was one of these kids that I met walking on the road. And she told me she lived nearby, and would I come home and meet her mother? And I said, absolutely. So I walked with her to her house and met her parents and the rest of her family. I mean, it was very friendly, very warm, very engaging. And the same with Bertha, Miss Bertha. I saw her sitting on her front porch. This is also on Edisto Island. I saw her sitting on her front porch, and I struck up a conversation with her, and she invited me in to sit by the fire. I didn't know her, but it was just very easy to speak to the island folks.
How old was she? How old was
She was close to 100. She was close to 100, but I mean, you could see that in her face.
But
And-
also you have cards. She's in the back.
Yes.
So she's also memorializing, her birthdays or whatever moments in here that there's a sense in this image here with the, canning and.
Well, what's interesting to me about this is just how organized everything is. Everything is, I walked into Emily's kitchen and I looked at that stove and I said, wow, that's like an old Vermont stove. and then the order in all of the glasses. And it's a lot of stuff, but everything had its order. And I just thought that was beautiful.
And then with Edisto and here I'm
This is Daufuskie.
in Daufuskie. Okay, so what is on the rope on the line? I couldn't.
Oh,
see.
it's fabric. It's I think it might be a sheet or a blanket. I can't remember exactly, but it's wet, and so that's why it has that sort of ambiguous look to it, because it's quite wet when she hung it up. But that's called Afternoon with Aunt Tootie.
But I love her doll.
Yeah. Yeah,
that
I do
we
too.
see
Yeah, I
within
mean,
this
it's
moment.
almost as large as Katrina
Right.
is.
Yeah.
And I love that she had a black doll. And this was 1977, 1978.
As we begin to wrap up, I was thinking about, Emory, if you could just talk to us about the sense of culture that you preserved it in the Penn Center. We know that the Peace Corps volunteers were trained on the island, mainly because of the temperature, and it was similar to when they were going to West Africa. So when we think about Jeannie's experience in West Africa, and can you talk about how important it was for some of the Peace Corps volunteers and the work that you brought to them?
Yes, Penn Center was a perfect setting for Peace Corps volunteers who were going to West Africa, because at the time, Penn Center was a poor housing place. You didn't have all of the modern conveniences. And so we were perfect for training people to go to West Africa. It was also a climate, very hot, lots of mosquitoes, humid. And then we had the farming grounds. And so we taught Peace Corps volunteers how to plant, how to grow food, how to harvest, how to prepare them. And the last day of training, we'd have the community to come in and feast on the food that that they had grown. But they also visited with small farmers on the island and learned how to grow certain foods and live with the family for a week. Now, these are young Americans, mostly non-Africans. And the most nervous time of their stay at Penn Center in 6 weeks is living with a black family. He said, I'm supposed to live with Miss Jones. Do you know her? And we always insist that the family allow them to mingle in the family and eat and sleep just like they did. No special preparation. And so they said the best time of their 2 years in Peace Corps was spent on St. Helena Island.
Wow. Gina, did you work with Emory with looking at these images and selecting? Did you discuss the process of editing?
I don't think we really discussed the editing, but we certainly talked about the pictures because, Emory knew everyone on Daufuskie. Everybody knew Emory, and so it was always fun to talk about the people who were in the photographs and, who they were and the expressions on their faces. So we often talked about them, but I think there were a couple of photographs where I said, what do you think about using this? And one was the one of Oching at the water, yeah. So this is one color photograph. I took a lot of color photographs when I was there, but this book was to be in black and white. But this is also a typical South African, Southern, just like in West Africa, casting nets. That was something that I had seen when I was there. And then to see this in South Carolina was very much what I had anticipated, those kinds of fishing villages, the techniques in fishing, the techniques in crabbing, and that I found them in South Carolina was inescapable.
But also memory with families, photographs that you've captured, hand on hips, moments like this. But also dress and style, the importance of when I first met you, Emory, you had a style. When
Emory still has
Right.
style.
And it was just something that just captivated us. And I remember Carrie Mae Weems said that she saw you, she said, I saw this tall drink of water.
That's great.
And I said,
Great
I have
description.
to photograph him. And she said how she just walked up to you to say, I need to know who you are and photograph. So it's
Beautiful.
fascinating that, how you have been, a figure for so many people. And this aspect of how do we capture spirituality, but how do we also preserve this memory of what you offered many of us who were exploring stories that were not our own, but we wanted this to be a part of our past. And here we see, music is central, culture is central, the flowers in this image. And do you want to talk about this a bit?
This image was taken at Frances Jones's house. She was the school teacher on the island. I think we mentioned her before. But this was taken in her living room, and her 106-year-old mother was living with her. So this house was all about memory, and it was about place, and it was about family, and this piano with all of these wonderful pictures really told the story
Right. And
of
the
her family.
doilies, too.
The doilies,
You know,
the flowers,
right.
absolutely. But the people in the pictures were so fascinating to me, and the cards. Even the cards are
and that's what
important.
I see that's cross-cultural. We know in the Caribbean, women are making doilies, and in West Africa and Italy. So when you think about the work of women in the craft, that you captured these stories that are about women's work and women's joy. You know, from family images to just what we see in the land here.
Basket making as well, yeah, which is big there.
So I just want to and this is the transportation.
This is the Waving Girl, and I took this photograph on the boat from Savannah going to Daufuskie for Blossom's funeral. And you'll see how everyone is dressed. It's like it's Sunday, but it's not. We're going to a funeral.
And this is
A trip from Savannah on to Daufuskie Island. People are just coming back, so the bags that they're carrying are things that they're bringing back from the mainland.
and this is where you capture the wind.
Yes.
And again,
It's
style.
called departures because, they're coming back on the island. And yes, the wind has captured Johnny Hamilton's, also known as Deacon Hamilton's tie.
So work, labor, and this memory.
Spirituality.
And also, it's, Emory, when you think about your work, you left to go to Boston, and you studied at Tufts, and when you decided to come back, or your invitation to come back, was it because we see these types of buildings that we knew that needed the story? Like when you first graduated from undergraduate, you were invited, and then you said no way, and then 6 years later.
Yeah, I actually was offered a job to teach on Daufuskie after graduating from undergrad school, and I thought it was the biggest insult I ever heard. That my mind was to go to the big city of Boston, and 6 years later I got invited back to come to Daufuskie to work. So, life is strange.
And the joy for that, what did that experience, how was that experience for you to come back?
Well, after being in Boston a while, I was prepared to come back and help and help to solve some of the problems of the islands.
I laugh because politically Boston was rough during that time period.
Oh yes, Boston was not.
Not only the politics, but the weather as well.
That's right. That's right. Just glad to get back.
Can I say something here? Because I don't know how much more time, but I cannot not mention that, and this always embarrasses Emory when I say this, when we're doing something together with this particular project. But I have to say that Emory is a hero of mine. And he is a hero because of how he has lived his life. And it's been about family, it's been about land, it's been about the importance of culture, and he's lived his life to improve. Not just his life, not just his family's life, but the life of the Gullah culture. And to have gone north and gone to school, gotten these advanced degrees, gotten several, I'm sorry, I know I can't help, but has gotten several honorary degrees, one from Bank Street College. And how many people do that? Get to, leave where they're from and, and they go back home and they make an indelible, lifelong investment and improvement in the place where they were born. So I have to say that whenever I'm with Emory, and even though I'm at the risk of always embarrassing him, I think it needs to be said.
Right.
Can I say that Jeanne Ashe is a hero of mine?
All right.
Because if it were not for Jeanne, Daufuskie Daufuskee's history would not have been documented. And we went to Daufuskie a couple of weeks ago. There were 16 Daufuskians left, 400 newcomers. The struggle we had to get a boat to Daufuskie to take people to the doctor and to take them to school was always a problem. There was always a backlash against getting a boat. My daughter Yoka and I went the other day, and the nice boat came on time. Nice enclosed boat. I think it's air conditioned in the summer. A stream of newcomers came off the boat to go to work on Hilton Head. And when we got off the boat coming back, a stream of folks went on the boat to go back to Daufuskie to live. Some 400 of them live on Daufuskie in comfort. What Jeanne documented is history that nobody would have known about. When you go to Daufuskie today, you would not believe that that existed. So Jeanne is a hero to all of us.
I totally agree. And thank you. So we're going to wrap up right now, and then just wanted to acknowledge, we mentioned Verda May a few times and how instrumental she was to both of you, and her experience. And this is a photograph that Jeanne made of Verda May that's just beautiful, and reflections of her memories in this. I also invited Verda May to write an essay in a book that I published, edited a few years ago, well, 25-something years ago. Many. But I always fascinated with Verda May, and I wanted to invite her to write about photographs. And she says that that her photographs are in a shoebox because we didn't make photographs, but we were storytellers. And she said, so you can imagine the stories through the photographs. And she shared that in that. So this is her mother, her grandmother, Estelle Smart. And she talked about her often. Did she
That's
talk
her on the cover.
That's her grandmother. Did she talk to you about her, about Estelle Smart?
Verda always talked about Estelle Smart. She mentioned her all the time. Verda lived with us. Verda came to visit, but Verda never leaves. So she would stay a couple of weeks. And my wife loved Verda being there because Verda was the cook. She was a great cook. The meal never on time, but you didn't mind waiting. Yeah, she's a great person.
So I just wanted to share that The Face of the Island is also a book that basically transformed my life as well. Lee Richmond Minor's history of the island, and to compare Jeanne's book, she's looking at the sea with this image, with this republication of it. And then also historically, the importance of the island. When we think about slavery and education and women, the photographs that were used by for different uses and different purposes. But some of these images tell a story. You know, we look at fashion, we know that women were there, there's an existence, and we see the house that you photographed, very similar architectural style of holding on to some of the memory of that arch, that air flow in the upper room. And then, you know, the washerwomen, the photographs of washerwomen during the Civil War, the importance of their work. They were the healthcare workers during that time. They took care and made sure that the soldiers had clean uniforms, and if they were wounded, that they were protected. But they washed the bandages, and celebrating these stories from, you know, like this is the Gullah of Hilton Head. These stories that we see, these images used a lot, but the stories are never told in the context of your involvement and Emory's involvement with the land. And this is another image that part of the village, the trees and this is a, a stereograph, and when we know this is used for tourists and for travelers, but also we know that these people posed, and they're looking into the camera because they are excited about the fact that they're acknowledged. You see their dress, you see that he is a chauffeur, and there's a worker, there are school children, but these are stories that just celebrate the school, the education, and the work of that island. And ending with this image is significant for me, and wanted to share these photographs. Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you so much.
Like, how much time do we have left? I think we have some 5 minutes for book signings, and okay. And then we have maybe 1 or 2 questions time for. Okay, so we have 2 hands and 2 questions. Okay, so.
We'll do 2 in a row, and then you guys can respond.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk this evening. Greetings to everyone on the panel. I was curious about some of the customs, traditions, perhaps hoodoo practices, folklore, especially as a Southerner, that that was familiar to you, and that perhaps that you encountered in West Africa, in the Gullah Islands, and perhaps growing up in New Orleans and all of that. So my family's from Pawleys Island. There's so many stories and premonitions and omens and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if that was just something that you encountered, and maybe perhaps you can speak about it.
And before we answer, can we have the second question as well?
Hi, thank you for this wonderful experience. I wanted to find out from Ms. Jeanne, are you going to do a follow-up on the island to see the changes that you spoke about? Just to see the difference of what was and what is now. And then for Mr. Emory, could you describe the difference between Geechee and Gullah? And lastly, Mr. Emory again, did you collaborate with the new museum in Charleston?
So Layla's first, yeah.
Well, actually, Emory, maybe you could address the foodways, but with West Africa and Gullah being on Daufuskie Island, there were, I wouldn't say really similarities, but my experience was more about, the fishing, the water experience, the crabbing. Not that I didn't have grits very often when I was on the island, one of my favorite things to have in the morning. But the foodways, maybe not so much as it was just the resources that were available to the islanders and how they used them for, for nourishment.
Rice is the big dish.
Rice, yep.
They used to call us rice-eating Geechees when I grew up, because every meal had to be rice, and rice was such a high value among families that you didn't eat rice for breakfast. You ate grits, as you said. But if you ever dared to eat rice, you might get punished, because rice was a dinner. And then we use rice and vegetables. We cook that together. We do a peas and rice thing you call hop and john. Or we do a crab and rice thing, or we do a shrimp and rice thing, which is a shrimp perlo. And you get your vegetables as a side dish. But rice is still a very, very big part of our meals. The other question had to do with...
Did you work with the Charleston Museum?
Yes, I think I was one of the first board members of Charleston Museum. But that work was pretty much done by Jim Clyburn. You know him. He was the spearhead person for that museum. Did all the funding, and we contributed, artifacts and help with interviews to get the stories. Something about superstition.
Yeah, just in terms of traditions of superstitions and storytelling in that way.
I don't know whether Jeanne documented any superstition, but
Well, most of the things that I think of with the superstition was painting on
Painting.
homes.
yes, blue.
There were certain colors that carried some spiritual meaning, or you would not color a certain you keep spirits away. But I think
We still don't don't walk over a grave in the cemetery. You always walk around the grave still, and you don't. You always go through a different door. You don't come out of this. You don't come out of this. You don't come through a door and then go out the other door. You come right back to the same door. Otherwise, bad luck to the house.
Right. That transferred up north as well. I just wanted to also just end with a few of my love of South Carolina, because my husband's family is from Florence, but spend time in it. This is a photograph in Orangeburg of a community that was, of course, no longer, but it was fascinating with the houses that were abandoned during this time, and wanted to document again these structures that have so much history. I also, one of my students, Zalik Azim, who's from family from Edisto, and she wanted to show families who were migrating to New York and using her grandmother's photographs and on the road. So just to say how South Carolina is special to all of us, and I want to say thank you to the Whitney and all of you for being here tonight. Bye-bye.
thank you everyone for coming.